General Langley must apologize. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's bold response to US and shocking showdown. In a dramatic and historic moment, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso, delivered a powerful and unapologetic response to US AFRICOM Commander General Michael Langley, following controversial comments that many saw as disrespectful to African sovereignty. This high-stakes diplomatic showdown has ignited global attention and sparked outrage across Africa and the diaspora, as Traoré boldly demands an apology from the United States and calls for respect, dignity, and African self-determination. In this video, you'll discover what General Langley said that triggered Traoré's response, Captain Traoré's exact words that shocked Western officials, African leaders and public reactions across the continent, the rising tensions between Burkina Faso and the U.S. military presence in Africa, what this means for the future of Africa, U.S. relations, and the anti-colonial movement. Captain Traoré continues to position himself as a fearless voice for African liberation, standing firm against foreign pressure and defending the dignity of his people. What General Langley said that triggered Traoré's response. General Michael Langley, commander of the United States Africa Command AFRICOM, sparked a diplomatic firestorm with remarks made during a U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee hearing in April 2025. According to posts on X, Langley accused Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the transitional president of Burkina Faso, of misappropriating the country's gold reserves for personal gain, specifically to bolster his personal security rather than addressing the needs of the Burkinabe people. He reportedly labeled Traoré a threat to his people, framing Burkina Faso's leadership as corrupt and destabilizing. These statements were part of a broader critique of Burkina Faso's shift away from Western partnerships, including its expulsion of French forces and growing alignment with Russia. Langley's accusations were particularly provocative given Burkina Faso's strategic importance in the Sahel, a region plagued by insurgencies and geopolitical competition. Gold is a cornerstone of Burkina Faso's economy, accounting for a significant portion of its export revenue, and Traoré's administration has prioritized national control over mining operations. By alleging misuse of these resources, Langley not only questioned Traoré's integrity, but also implied that Burkina Faso's sovereignty-driven policies were detrimental to its citizens. The remarks were perceived in Burkina Faso as an attempt to delegitimize Traoré's government, potentially laying the groundwork for external intervention or sanctions. This rhetoric echoed historical Western critiques of African leaders who challenged neo-colonial structures, intensifying suspicions of U.S. motives. The timing of Langley's statements, shortly before a reported coup attempt against Traoré, further amplified their impact. While no direct evidence ties the U.S. to the coup, the sequence of events fueled narratives on X and in Burkina Faso that Langley's words were a prelude to destabilization efforts. The accusations thus served as a catalyst for Traoré's forceful response, igniting a broader confrontation over African sovereignty and Western influence. Captain Traoré's exact words that shocked Western officials. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's response to General Langley's allegations was swift, unapologetic, and resonant, cementing his status as a bold voice against Western hegemony. According to X posts, Traoré declared, "Our gold, not yours. Africa is no longer under Western control. Foreign powers need to stop." This statement was delivered in a public address, likely broadcast to maximize its reach, and was accompanied by a directive to Burkina Faso's military to prepare for what is coming, signaling heightened vigilance against perceived external threats. Traoré's words were a direct rebuke of Langley's accusations, framing them as an assault on Burkina Faso's right to control its resources and chart its own path. The phrasing of Traoré's response was deliberately confrontational, rejecting the paternalistic tone of Langley's critique. By asserting that Africa is no longer under Western control, Traoré invoked a pan-African narrative of liberation, drawing parallels to historical anti-colonial struggles. His reference to gold was particularly significant, as it underscored Burkina Faso's efforts to nationalize its mining sector and reduce dependence on Western corporations. The call for foreign powers to stop was a broader indictment of interventions, military, economic, and diplomatic, that have shaped African governance for decades. Western officials were reportedly shocked by the intensity and clarity of Traoré's rhetoric. Unlike the diplomatic restraint often expected from African leaders, Traoré's response was unyielding, signaling a refusal to engage on Western terms. His military directive further alarmed US and European officials, who interpreted it as a sign of potential escalation, possibly including further restrictions on Western personnel or assets in Burkina Faso. Traoré's words also reverberated on X, where they were amplified by users across Africa and the diaspora, framing him as a modern-day Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's iconic revolutionary leader. This comparison heightened Western concerns about Traoré's growing influence as a symbol of resistance, capable of inspiring similar defiance in other African nations. African leaders and public reactions across the continent. The clash between Langley and Traoré elicited a wave of reactions across Africa, reflecting both solidarity with Burkina Faso and broader frustration with Western interference. In Burkina Faso, Traoré's response galvanized public support. Thousands took to the streets of Ouagadougou and other cities, protesting Langley's remarks and chanting slogans in favor of national sovereignty. These demonstrations, reported on X, were not only a show of support for Traoré, but also a rejection of what many Burkinabés saw as neo-colonial arrogance. Burkina Faso's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Karamoko Jean-Marie Traoré, issued a statement on April 15, 2025, condemning Langley's comments as disparaging and unacceptable, demanding an apology and reaffirming Burkina Faso's commitment to self-determination. Across the continent, Traoré's defiance struck a chord with leaders and citizens alike. In Mali and Niger, where governments have similarly expelled French forces and criticized Western military presence, Traoré's stance was likely seen as a validation of their own policies. Leaders in these countries, facing domestic pressure to assert greater control over resources and security, may have drawn inspiration from Traoré's ability to mobilize public support against external criticism. In countries like Ghana, Nigeria, and South Africa, where debates over foreign influence are less militarized but still potent, Traoré's rhetoric resonated with activists and intellectuals advocating for economic decolonization. Public reactions, particularly among Africa's youth, were amplified on platforms like X, where Traoré was celebrated as a Pan-African hero. Hashtags and memes praising his leadership proliferated, often juxtaposing his image with Sankara's and invoking themes of resource sovereignty and anti-imperialism. This digital groundswell reflected a generational shift, with younger Africans increasingly vocal about rejecting Western narratives that portray their leaders as corrupt when they prioritize national interests. However, not all reactions were uniformly positive. Some African analysts, particularly in pro-Western circles, cautioned that Traoré's confrontational approach risked isolating Burkina Faso economically, highlighting the pragmatic challenges of defying global powers. The continental response underscored a growing divide. While Western-aligned elites in some African capitals may prefer cautious engagement with the US, the broader public, especially in the Sahel, is increasingly supportive of leaders like Traoré who challenge the status quo. This dynamic suggests a deepening anti-colonial sentiment, with implications for how African governments navigate international partnerships. The rising tensions between Burkina Faso and the US military presence in Africa. The Traoré-Langley dispute has significantly heightened tensions between Burkina Faso and the United States, particularly regarding AFRICOM's role in Africa. Burkina Faso's foreign policy has shifted markedly since Traoré's rise to power in 2022, with the country expelling French troops, suspending military agreements with Western partners, and forging security and economic ties with Russia. Langley's remarks, perceived as an attempt to undermine Traoré's legitimacy, exacerbated distrust of U.S. intentions. The reported coup attempt in Burkina Faso, occurring days after Langley's Senate testimony, further inflamed suspicions of U.S. involvement, though no definitive evidence supports this claim. On X, users speculated about CIA or AFRICOM orchestration, reflecting a pervasive belief in Western meddling. AFRICOM, established in 2007 to counter terrorism and promote stability, operates in dozens of African countries, including through bases, training programs, and drone operations. However, its presence is increasingly contentious. In Burkina Faso and neighboring Sahelian states, AFRICOM is viewed by some as a tool for securing U.S. geopolitical and economic interests, such as access to minerals and countering Chinese and Russian influence, rather than addressing local security needs. Traoré's directive to prepare for what is coming suggests a belief that the U.S. may escalate pressure, potentially through proxies, sanctions, or covert operations. This rhetoric aligns with Burkina Faso's broader strategy of reducing reliance on Western security frameworks, as evidenced by its withdrawal from ECOWAS and alignment with the Alliance of Sahel States. The tensions reflect a broader regional trend. Mali and Niger have also expelled Western forces, citing inefficacy against insurgencies and sovereignty concerns. Burkina Faso's stance amplifies this momentum, challenging the U.S. to justify AFRICOM's footprint. The controversy has also strained diplomatic channels, with Burkina Faso's government less likely to engage constructively with U.S. officials post-war. For the U.S., the risk is a loss of influence in the Sahel, a region critical for counterterrorism and resource access, potentially ceding ground to Russia and China. What this means for the future of Africa, U.S. relations and the anti-colonial movement. The Traoré-Langley confrontation is a pivotal moment for Africa, U.S. relations and the anti-colonial movement, with far-reaching implications. For Africa, U.S. relations, the incident highlights a growing disconnect. The U.S. approach, exemplified by Langley's public criticism, risks alienating African nations that prioritize sovereignty over Western approval. AFRICOM's model of security cooperation, which often involves conditions tied to governance or economic policies, is increasingly at odds with the aspirations of governments like Burkina Faso's. If the U.S. continues to frame defiant leaders as threats, it may push more countries toward alternative partners like Russia, which has provided military support to Burkina Faso, or China, which offers infrastructure investment with fewer political demands. The U.S. faces a strategic dilemma: recalibrate its engagement to emphasize mutual respect and partnership, or double down on containment strategies that could backfire. A failure to adapt could erode U.S. influence, particularly in the Sahel, where anti-Western sentiment is rising. Diplomatic efforts, such as development aid or trade initiatives, could mitigate tensions, but these must avoid the perception of neo-colonial strings. The Biden administration's Africa policy, already criticized for lacking innovation, will be tested by how it navigates this crisis. For the anti-colonial movement, Traoré's response is a galvanizing force. His assertion that Africa is no longer under Western control taps into a deep well of historical grievances, from colonial exploitation to post-independence interventions. The movement, invigorated by figures like Traoré, is gaining traction among Africa's youth, who see resource nationalism and political independence as intertwined. On X, Traoré's rhetoric is framed as a continuation of Sankara's legacy, emphasizing self-reliance and Pan-African unity. This resonates in countries facing similar struggles, from Ghana's push for value-added mineral processing to Zimbabwe's land reforms. However, the anti-colonial movement faces challenges. Burkina Faso's economic vulnerabilities, including reliance on gold exports and ongoing insurgencies, highlight the difficulty of translating rhetoric into governance. Traoré's alignment with Russia, while pragmatic, risks new forms of dependency, as Moscow's interests are not altruistic. The movement must also contend with internal divisions, as not all African governments or elites support radical shifts away from Western partnerships. For example, Nigeria and Kenya, key U.S. allies, may view Traoré's approach as destabilizing to regional blocs like ECOWAS. Looking ahead, the Traoré-Langley clash could redefine Africa's geopolitical landscape. A sustained anti-colonial push could lead to greater regional integration, with alliances like the Alliance of Sahel States challenging Western-dominated frameworks. However, success depends on delivering tangible benefits, security, economic growth, and social progress to counter Western narratives of African mismanagement. For the U.S., fostering genuine partnerships rather than coercive influence will be critical to maintaining relevance in an Africa increasingly assertive of its autonomy.